Hey, before anything else, can I ask you a quick favor? Your subscription is what keeps this channel alive. If you've ever felt something from this story or any of the others, or if this channel has ever made your day better, please make sure to hit that subscribe button. It helps me way more than you can imagine. Now, let's get into the story. Louise had lost count of how many formal dinners she had endured this month alone, each one ending with her politely refusing yet another prince. The great hall sparkled with chandeliers and gold-framed portraits of past rulers, but all she could think about was how suffocating the air felt when every pair of eyes in the room followed her. She smiled for her parents, exchanged rehearsed pleasantries with suitors, and waited for the moment she could slip away. And tonight, as always, she found her escape in the palace gardens, where the moonlight turned the fountains silver and the roses whispered in the breeze. Camilla was already there, leaning against the stone railing, her gown a soft shade of midnight blue that caught the light in ways that made Louise's breath falter. "Another one turned away?" Camilla asked with a knowing smile, her voice carrying the warmth that no courtly title could ever match. "He talked about hunting for 20 straight minutes," Louise said, rolling her eyes, but she didn't mention how the only part of the evening worth remembering was this, the quiet with Camilla, the way the world always felt less heavy in her presence. They had known each other since they were children racing through the palace corridors, skirts flying, chased by the scolding of servants. Over the years, the games had turned into long talks in hidden corners, the easy touch of a hand on an arm, a glance held just a heartbeat longer than friendship required. Louise didn't dare name the feeling, not even in her own thoughts. But tonight, as Camilla stepped closer, the faint scent of jasmine surrounding her, Louise wondered, not for the first time, if Camilla knew just how much space she took up in her heart. The next morning began with the soft chime of the palace bells, their sound echoing through the marble halls like a reminder that duty was never more than a breath away. Louise stood at her bedroom window, watching the courtyard below come alive, guards changing shifts, maids carrying baskets of linens, and a pair of stable boys racing each other toward the stables. It was all so familiar, yet lately she felt like a stranger in her own life, trapped in a role she had never chosen. Her mother's knock came before she could lose herself in the scene any further. Queen Eleanor entered without waiting for an invitation, her presence commanding as always. "Louise, we need to talk," she said, her tone carrying the weight of inevitability. Louise turned, bracing herself. "If this is about last night, it is," the queen cut in, her expression unreadable. "You're 22. The council is growing impatient, and your father and I cannot stall them forever. The neighboring kingdoms expect a marriage alliance, and every refusal you make reflects on us all." Louise's jaw tightened. "I'm not a prize to be traded for politics." "You are a princess," her mother replied sharply, "and that means your life is not entirely your own." The words stung because they were true, yet Louise felt the quiet rebellion in her chest harden. She wanted to say she would never marry someone she didn't love, but that would open questions she wasn't ready to answer. Instead, she bowed her head slightly and murmured, "I understand." But she didn't, not in the way her mother wanted. The day passed in a blur of meetings and ceremonial appearances, yet her mind kept drifting to Camilla. By late afternoon, she found her in the library, seated in the alcove where sunlight poured through tall windows, painting her hair in shades of gold and chestnut. Camilla glanced up from her book, smiling in that way that always seemed to melt the noise of the world away. "You look like you're plotting an escape," she teased. Louise sat beside her, close enough to smell the faint trace of ink on her fingers. "Maybe I am," Louise said, lowering her voice. "My parents want me to choose a husband before my next birthday. If I don't, they'll arrange it for me." Camilla's expression faltered for the briefest second, but she quickly masked it with a thoughtful tilt of her head. "You've turned away every prince for years. They must have known this would happen eventually." "I know," Louise whispered, feeling the weight of each word. "But it's not that I haven't found the right one. It's that the right one doesn't exist in the way they think." Camilla's gaze searched hers, as if trying to read the meaning hidden between the lines. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the rustle of pages from a distant table and the quiet hum of the afternoon breeze against the glass. Louise wanted to say more, wanted to let the truth spill out, consequences be damned, but she hesitated. She thought of the council, the watchful eyes of the court, the whispers that would spread like wildfire if anyone knew. So instead she asked, "Will you walk with me in the gardens tonight?" Camilla's lips curved into a small, warm smile. Always. That evening, the gardens glowed under the moonlight, the air fragrant with blooming lilies. They strolled side by side along the gravel path, their shoulders brushing now and then. Louise found herself memorizing every detail, the sound of Camilla's soft laugh, the way her fingers toyed absently with the ribbon at her waist, the faint dimple in her cheek when she smiled. When they reached the old fountain, Camilla leaned against the edge, her eyes catching the silver reflection of the water. "You've been distant lately," Camilla said quietly. "Not with me, exactly, but with yourself. Like you're holding your breath all the time." Louise's heart pounded. "Maybe I am," she admitted, "because I'm afraid that if I let it out, everything will change." Camilla's brows drew together slightly. "Change isn't always bad." "It can be," Louise countered, though she knew the truth was more complicated. What she feared wasn't change itself, but what it would reveal. About her, about them, about the years of unspoken truths between them. Camilla reached out, brushing a loose strand of hair from Louise's face in a gesture so gentle it nearly unraveled her resolve. "You've never been afraid of anything before," she murmured. Louise wanted to laugh at that. She was terrified of her parents, of the court, of the feelings she had buried for years but could no longer deny. "I'm afraid of losing what matters most to me," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Camilla's eyes softened, but she didn't press for clarity. Instead, she turned her gaze to the roses climbing the nearby trellis. "Whatever it is, you don't have to face it alone." The words should have comforted her, yet they only deepened the ache in her chest. Because the one thing she couldn't imagine was a life where Camilla wasn't beside her. And yet, if her parents had their way, that was exactly the future she would be forced to accept. As they walked back toward the palace, the air between them felt charged, as though each unspoken thought had woven itself into a thread pulling them closer together. But Louise knew she couldn't give in. Not yet. Not until she decided whether she was brave enough to fight for the one person she could never stop loving, even if she had never dared to say it aloud. 3 days later, the palace was in a frenzy. Servants rushed through the corridors carrying bolts of silk and trays of polished silver, the air thick with the scent of beeswax polish and anticipation. Louise had no idea why until she was summoned to the council chamber. The long oak table gleamed under the morning light streaming through the high windows, her father seated at the head with Queen Eleanor at his side, flanked by half a dozen advisors. "Louise," her father began, his tone formal in the way that meant he was speaking as king, not as her parent. "The council has reached a decision. In 1 month's time, we will host the Winter Court Gala. You will announce your betrothal that evening." The words landed like a physical blow. Louise kept her expression neutral, trained from years of diplomacy, but inside her thoughts spun wildly. "And if I haven't chosen anyone by then?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. The Queen's voice was cool and precise. "Then we will choose for you. The Duke of Wexford has already expressed interest in a union. His family's influence would strengthen our position considerably." Louise's pulse roared in her ears. The Duke of Wexford was nearly twice her age, known for his ambition and his disregard for those beneath his station. The idea of binding herself to him made her stomach turn. "May I have time to consider?" she asked, her voice steady but strained. "You have until the gala," her father said. "No more." She left the chamber with her hands clenched, her mind replaying every word. The corridors felt narrower, the walls pressing in on her. She found Camilla in the East Wing, supervising the arrangement of flowers for the visiting ambassadors. "You look like you're about to declare war," Camilla said with a wry smile. "Maybe I am," Louise muttered. She pulled her aside, away from the curious eyes of the servants. "They've given me a deadline, 1 month. Either I choose someone to marry or they'll choose for me. And they've already decided who that someone will be. Camilla's smile faded, replaced by a tension that mirrored Louise's own. Who? The Duke of Wexford. Camilla's jaw tightened, her hands curling into fists at her sides. You can't, Louise. You can't marry him. Do you think I don't know that? Louise snapped, then immediately softened her tone. I don't want him, Camilla. I don't want any of them. Camilla studied her for a long moment, her eyes searching Louise's face as though trying to read the truth she wasn't saying. Then who do you want? The question hung between them, heavy and dangerous. Louise's breath caught, but before she could answer, a pair of attendants entered the hall with a flurry of papers, calling Camilla's name. Camilla stepped back, her expression unreadable, and Louise felt the chance slip away like sand through her fingers. That night, she couldn't sleep. She wandered the dimly lit corridors until she found herself at the tower balcony, the city below glowing like a constellation. She thought of all the moments she and Camilla had shared, laughing until their sides hurt after sneaking into the kitchens as girls, whispering secrets under the canopy of the summer pavilion, holding hands under the table during the endless speeches at banquets when neither could bear another polite smile. It had always been there, this quiet thread between them, but she had never dared to pull it. Now she wondered if she had any choice left. The next day, invitations for the Winter Court Gala went out to the rulers of every neighboring kingdom, the list of eligible suitors growing longer with each passing hour. Her mother had her measured for new gowns, her father reminded her of the political stakes, and everywhere she went the court buzzed with speculation about which lucky prince or duke would finally win her hand. Only Camilla stayed silent. She still appeared at Louise's side, still walked with her in the gardens at night, still shared knowing glances across crowded rooms, but there was a new distance in her eyes, as if she were holding back something Louise desperately wanted her to say. One evening, they found themselves in the music room, Camilla at the piano, her fingers moving gracefully over the keys. Louise leaned against the instrument, watching her. That's new, she said softly. I've never heard you play that piece before. Camilla's lips curved faintly. It's called The Last Dance. Sounds ominous. It's meant to be, Camilla replied, her gaze flicking up to meet Louise's for a heartbeat before returning to the keys. It's about knowing something is ending and choosing to make the most of the time left. Louise felt her chest tighten. She wanted to say that nothing between them was ending, but with the deadline looming, she couldn't be sure. Instead, she asked, if you had 1 month left before everything changed, what would you do? Camilla's hands stilled on the keys, the final notes fading into the air. I'd tell the truth, she said, her voice so quiet Louise almost missed it. But before Louise could press her, Camilla rose from the bench, offered a small smile, and left the room, leaving Louise with the echo of her words and the unsettling feeling that the truth Camilla spoke of might be the very thing Louise had been too afraid to face. The palace had never felt so crowded, yet Louise had never felt more alone. Every day brought new arrivals, foreign dignitaries, their children dressed in silks and jewels, each smile a calculated move in the endless game of alliances. Her parents paraded her through reception after reception, each introduction laced with the unspoken reminder that time was running out. Through it all, Camilla was there, but not in the way she had been before. She still attended her duties as the daughter of the royal counselor, still stood near during public functions, but there was a careful distance now, a space in her gaze that hadn't existed before the council's announcement. It was subtle, but Louise felt it like a missing note in a familiar song. One afternoon, Louise caught sight of her in the western corridor, speaking quietly with her mother. The moment Camilla noticed her, she excused herself and walked away without more than a polite nod. That small gesture, a nod where once there would have been a lingering smile, sat in Louise's chest like a stone. That evening, unable to bear the tension, Louise sought her out in the stables, where Camilla often went when she needed solitude. She found her brushing down a bay mare, her sleeves rolled up, hair loose from its usual pins. The sight sent a pang through Louise, the memory of countless summers they had spent here as girls flooding her mind. You've been avoiding me, Louise said, stepping closer. Camilla didn't look up. I've been busy. Too busy to talk. Too busy to walk in the gardens with me like we always do. Camilla's hands stilled on the horse's neck. Louise, things are different now. You have a month to choose a husband. I can't pretend that doesn't change anything. Louise's breath caught. It doesn't change us. Doesn't it? Camilla finally met her eyes, and in that gaze Louise saw everything she had been trying not to think about. The fear, the longing, the unspoken truth balanced on the edge of a precipice. You'll be married to someone else by the end of the year. I have to think about what comes after that. I don't want someone else, Louise said, the words slipping out sharper than she intended. Then who do you want? Camilla's voice was steady, but her eyes searched Louise's face with quiet desperation. Louise opened her mouth, but the clatter of hooves on the cobblestone announced the arrival of the grooms, and the moment shattered. Camilla stepped back, murmured something about finishing her work, and left Louise standing there with her heart pounding and her hands trembling. Love what you've seen so far, and want to help me keep creating these awesome stories on this channel? Then subscribe and hit the bell. Your subscription supports the channel and makes sure you get more exciting stories. The days that followed were a blur of obligations. The gala preparations consumed the palace, with tailors, florists, and musicians weaving in and out of the halls. Louise went through the motions, smiling where she was expected to, answering polite questions from would-be suitors, but her mind was always somewhere else, on Camilla, on the way her absence was starting to feel like a physical ache. One night, after yet another formal dinner, Louise slipped out onto the balcony overlooking the moonlit gardens. To her surprise, Camilla was there, leaning against the balustrade, her profile etched in silver light. I thought you'd stopped coming out here, Louise said softly. Camilla didn't turn. I thought I had too. Louise stepped beside her, close enough to feel the warmth of her arm. Why are you really pulling away? Camilla's lips pressed together before she answered. Because every time I'm near you, it gets harder to remember that I don't get to keep you. The words hit Louise like an arrow, stealing her breath. She wanted to say that Camilla was wrong, that she belonged to no one else, but the weight of expectation, of centuries of tradition, sat heavy on her tongue. Instead, she reached for Camilla's hand. For a moment, Camilla didn't move, and then, slowly, she let their fingers entwine. They stood like that for a long time, silent under the stars, the truth hovering just out of reach. When the sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor, Camilla gently pulled away, leaving Louise with the ghost of her touch and the sudden, unshakable certainty that if she didn't act soon, she might lose the only person she had ever truly wanted. The night of the preliminary reception arrived like a storm modestly dressed in silk, and from the moment Louise stepped into the mirror-bright ballroom, she felt the pressure of every gaze settle over her shoulders, like a cloak lined with lead. The ceiling soared with painted constellations, chandeliers burned with 1,000 tiny suns, and the orchestra tested a shimmering scale that trembled through the polished floor. Courtiers clustered in jeweled constellations of their own, whispers curving from group to group. The gala is in 3 weeks. The princess must choose. Louise wore a gown of moonlit satin that skimmed her figure, a diplomatic compromise between her mother's severity and her own aversion to spectacle, but all she could think about was whether Camilla would be near enough to catch her if she stumbled through the charade. She found her soon enough, standing beside Counselor Maris, poised and composed, hair twisted into a knot that bared the elegant line of her neck, a quill tucked like a weapon behind her ear, ready to note which emissary requested which song, which duke asked which inappropriate question, which prince found himself suddenly enchanted by a princess who refused to be bought. Camilla's eyes found Louise across the room with the force of a tether, the look they exchanged brief and devastating. You're here. I'm here. Be careful. The Duke of Wexford arrived late and loud, perfumed with something sharp, his cloak trailing winter fox, his smile as practiced as a knife. He bowed over Louise's hand with a flourish that made a ripple of approval sweep the court, and began to talk as if he had been waiting years to hear his own voice inside these walls. He spoke of ships and tariffs, of game preserves and profit margins, of how modern alliances should be built on mutual benefit and sensible heirs. Louise answered with diplomacy carved thin as glass, neither agreeing nor refusing, and felt Camilla's stillness like a lighthouse on a black sea. But even a lighthouse cannot stop the tide. The master of ceremonies announced the opening waltz, the orchestra unfurled the first notes, and the Duke extended his hand with a theatrical inevitability. Louise took it, because she was a princess, because the room was full, because she could not declare war with a single refusal, and allowed herself to be led onto the floor. The Duke moved competently, his hand heavy at her waist, his palm too warm against her glove. He spoke as they turned, the steps precise, each pivot a negotiation. "Your kingdom is resource-rich," he said with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Imagine what we could accomplish together. Stability, prosperity, legacy." Louise imagined none of it. She imagined instead the brush of Camilla's fingers as they had twined on the balcony, the way Camilla breathed in before a difficult truth and out before an act of courage, the summer-sweet sound of her laugh when they'd raced barefooted across the east lawn as girls and rolled breathless into the clover. The music blazed and softened, couples swirling like planets in a choreography of obligation, and then a shift in the crowd revealed Camilla at the ballroom's edge, her hands folded before her expression calm in the way of a surface that hides a riptide. The sight of her hit Louise so hard she missed a beat. The Duke's hand tightened. "Careful, Your Highness," he murmured, and the word felt like a leash. "I'm quite steady," she said, and forced her body back into the pattern while her heart beat out an unscripted measure. A second dance followed, this time with a prince from the Southern Isles who spoke softly of poetry and oranges and sailed gardens, then a third with a viscount who asked if Louise preferred falconry or hounds. At the edge of each turn, at the end of every phrase, she found Camilla again, taking notes for Counselor Maris, adjusting a candle's guttering flame, refusing a glass of wine with a small shake of her head, and the world slotted back into a shape she could endure. But endurance frays under scrutiny, and the court had sharpened its curiosity to a fine point. Rumor moved through the ballroom like a draft beneath a door. The princess never lingers with any suitor. The princess spends late nights in the gardens. The princess walks with the counselor's daughter under the moon. Louise felt the whisper, but it was the weight of the queen's gaze that made her spine lock. Queen Eleanor stood on the dais beside the king, her expression composed, her eyes cool as polished steel. Beside her, the king's jaw worked as if wrestling with a private calculus. Louise finished the third dance and excused herself with the grace of a bird escaping a cage by pretending it was simply circling the room. She drifted toward the refreshments, accepted a goblet of water, and laid a hand against a chilled marble column to steady herself. Camilla appeared at her side, as if answering a call neither of them had made aloud. "Careful," Camilla said under her breath, not looking directly at her, their shoulders almost touching. "Your hand is shaking." "I'm fine," Louise said, though her pulse trembled like a trapped songbird. "You're not," Camilla replied, the corner of her mouth softening. "They're watching." "They always are," Louise said, and dared a glance at her, just long enough to catch the warmth in Camilla's eyes, a brief bloom in winter. "Walk with me." 2 minutes. The conservatory. "You'll be missed," Camilla warned. "Let them miss me," Louise whispered, then stepped away with the practiced drift of a hostess making a simple circuit. Camilla followed after an appropriate interval, pausing to exchange a word with a page, redirect a servant carrying sugared figs, sign something Counselor Maris thrust at her, then slipping into the glass-limbed quiet of the conservatory, where the air smelled of damp soil, lemon leaves, and the night's first frost. The music dimmed beyond the door. The lanterns inside cast gentle halos over the ferns. For a heartbeat they only breathed, the hush so complete it felt sacrilegious to break it. Louise spoke first, because silence was starting to feel like a current pulling them out to sea. "I danced with 3 men and thought of you with every step." Camilla closed her eyes like the words hurt and healed in equal measure. "Don't," she said, voice low. "Please don't say things you can't afford to mean." "I mean all of it," Louise said, the truth shocking in her mouth, a spark against tinder half a decade dry. I have always meant it, even when I didn't have the courage to name it. Camilla's breath hitched. She opened her eyes, and there it was, the storm breaking behind them. Louise, she whispered, and her name in Camilla's mouth felt like a vow. Footsteps clicked beyond the glass. Camilla flinched back a fraction, and the moment narrowed to a blade's edge. A maid hurried past the outer hall and vanished, but the spell had broken just enough for caution to flood in. Camilla shook her head slightly. You have 3 weeks, she said, the practical soldier reassembling herself. Every word you speak between now and then will be used to build your future or to destroy it. Choose carefully. What would you have me choose? Louise asked, stepping closer until they shared a single breath of lemon and fear. If it were only my heart, I would ask you to choose me, Camilla said, eyes burning. But it isn't only your heart. It's the crown. It's the people who depend on your stability. It's your father's treaties and your mother's hard-won peace, and all the children who will never learn your name but will feel the ripples of your decisions. Louise wanted to say that love could be a form of stability if one dared build on it. She wanted to say that her heart had been loyal to Camilla longer than any contract could be to a duke. She wanted to say that she would rather be a free woman with no throne than a caged queen with a gilded ring. But the door creaked and laughter approached, and the moment demanded sacrifice. Camilla's hand hovered in the small space between them, not touching, a ghost of all the times they had touched without knowing what it meant. I can't watch you promise yourself to someone else, Camilla said, voice barely there. So, if you must, don't let me be in the room. What does that mean? Louise asked, the words scraping raw. It means I will do my duty until the gala, Camilla said, each syllable steady as a measured step. And then, if you choose another, I'll ask to be sent to the northern provinces with Counselor Maris when she retires next month. There is a school to establish, roads to repair, 1,000 unromantic tasks that make a life. I will make one. The idea of a world where Camilla's laughter did not live in these halls struck Louise like a blow, leaving her breathless. Don't leave, she said, and heard the naked plea in it. Then don't let them take you, Camilla answered, and there it was, the impossible arithmetic of their years distilled to a single problem without a clean solution. The footsteps passed, the music swelled. Duty gnawed through the quiet like moths in silk. Camilla stepped back, smoothed her skirt, and reaffixed the professional calm to her face like a mask. We should return, she said. They'll notice. Let them, Louise said, but she followed, because a princess does not set fires she isn't ready to fight. The ballroom received them like a tide reclaiming a shore. The Duke intercepted Louise with a glass of wine he did not offer so much as a sign, his smile too intimate for a man who knew nothing of her. Your Highness, he said, the foreign press are in attendance. A short promenade along the southern gallery would send a favorable message. The Queen's glance from the dais made refusal unwise. Louise nodded once and allowed herself to be escorted beneath oil portraits of queens who had bent rather than broken. As they walked, murmurs rose behind their progress like foam behind a keel. Louise kept her chin high and her steps measured, but in the glass she caught a reflection that wasn't hers. The curve of Camilla's profile as she spoke to a herald, the slightest tremor in her hand as she passed a card to the master of ceremonies, the careful control of a woman bracing for impact. The promenade ended at a window that looked out over the dark gardens, lanterns bobbing like tethered stars. The Duke leaned closer than courtesy allowed, voice low. I trust your hesitation is a performance, Princess. The world admires resolve. Louise turned her head and smiled with all the polish her tutors had ever scolded into her. I'm always performing, she said, and slipped free under the pretense of greeting a baroness whose name she could not recall. By the time the orchestra struck the final set, the court had built a story from scraps, that the princess looked radiant with the Duke, that the princess looked bored with the Duke, that the princess had disappeared to the conservatory, that the counselor's daughter had also disappeared, that nothing had happened at all, and everything had. When the last chord hung trembling in the air and applause washed the room clean, Louise felt both emptied and overfull, a vessel one storm short of shattering. Camilla stood near the exit, collecting notes for the morning's debrief, the very picture of order. Louise passed her so close their sleeves brushed. Neither of them turned their heads. 3 weeks, Camilla breathed, the words so quiet they were almost just breath. I know, Louise murmured without moving her lips and kept walking, because if she stopped she might say the one true thing in front of witnesses. Outside, the night tasted of iron and frost. Louise braced her hands on the balustrade and let the cold bite her until the sting steadied her pulse. Somewhere behind her, doors opened and closed, laughter thinned. The orchestra began packing away their instruments. She imagined a future in a northern province full of roads and ledgers with Camilla's handwriting on them instead of petals and moonlight. She imagined a future where a fox-furred duke stood at her side and called it prosperity. She imagined, impossibly and with terror, a future where she chose neither and dared to rename the word inheritance. She did not decide. Not yet. But for the first time, she felt the decision reaching for her like a tide she could no longer pretend was distant, and she promised the sky and, secretly, the girl who had grown up beside her, that when it came, she would not look away. The palace woke to a different kind of hush the next morning, the kind that follows a rumor sharp enough to cut. Louise felt it in the way servants paused mid-curtsy to flick a glance at her, in the clipped exchanges between footmen that ceased when she approached, in the cool note threaded through her mother's greeting at breakfast. 3 weeks had become 17 days, and time seemed to lean forward, impatient. She pushed her food around the plate until the king cleared his throat and the queen laid down her knife with the same finality she used on policy. We were pleased with your composure last night, Queen Eleanor said, which meant you did not embarrass us. There will be more opportunities to demonstrate resolve, the king added, which meant decide faster. The foreign press remarked on your poise, the queen continued, and on the excellent management of the event. The faintest pause. Please thank Councillor Maris's daughter. The words were neutral. The look that followed carried a question. How close are you prepared to stand to a flame everyone else pretends not to see? Louise murmured assent, requested the day's schedule, and fled into duty before her throat could tighten. The hours marched. Meetings with the Master of Revels, a ceremonial inspection of the city orphanage's winter provisions, a brief audience with the envoy from the Eastern Archipelago who spoke in metaphors about tides and fidelity. Through it all, Camilla flickered at the edges, efficient, unflappable, wearing a pin Louise had never seen before, a small enamel sprig of rosemary, for remembrance. They didn't speak until late afternoon when Councillor Maris sent Camilla to deliver a stack of correspondence to the princess's study. The door closed behind her with a hush that made Louise's chest ache. There are letters from 3 dukedoms, 2 principalities, and the Guild Council, Camilla said, laying them on the desk with careful hands. All believe last night was promising. Promising for whom? Louise asked, and the dryness of her tone made Camilla's mouth twitch despite the pall over the day. For trade, certainly, Camilla said, then softened. For you? I don't know. I do, Louise said, and the truth of it lit her from within, small and stubborn as a candle in a draught. Camilla watched her, the brave steadiness in her gaze at odds with the distance she'd been forcing between them. There's something else, she said. A publication from the capital printed a sketch of the conservatory. Nothing incriminating, just lanterns, silhouettes. But the caption implies secrets. The council has asked the Master of Ceremonies to limit how long you disappear from public view. Louise felt heat crawl up her neck. A silhouette and a caption, she said, trying for lightness and failing. Truly, the realm quakes. You know it's not about the drawing, Camilla replied gently. It's about the story. They can build on top of it. Louise thought of foxfur and smiles like snares, of treaties weighted like stones, of a childhood spent in halls that taught her how to read a room before she could read a book. Then we'll give them a different story, she said. Camilla shook her head. That's not what I meant. Her hand hovered above the desk, then withdrew. I meant be careful with your steps. They're counting them. I know who is counting, Louise said. And then, because recklessness felt more honest than caution, and I know who taught me to walk without stumbling. Camilla's eyes warmed. A sunrise glimpsed through fog. 17 days, she said, a reminder and a prayer. The next week unfolded like a chess problem everyone pretended was a dance. The court staged a hawking exhibition on the south lawn. Louise handled a Merlin with the competence of long practice, while the Duke of Wexford held forth on bloodlines and leverage. A prince from the archipelago recited a poem about oranges that made half the court sigh. A baron's daughter with a fine mind asked incisive questions about trade routes and looked genuinely interested in Louise's answers. A visiting duchess hinted that a marriage between women could be made respectable if a cousin signed certain papers, then laughed, as if she hadn't meant it, while watching Louise's face closely. Meanwhile, Camilla's world compressed to lists and maps and meetings with carpenters about the northern road repairs she'd mentioned. She spent an entire morning drafting a memorandum on grain storage that would prevent an early thaw from spoiling the reserves, and another evening negotiating quietly with a merchant whose ships had a habit of arriving late. Louise found excuses to cross her path. A query about the gala seating chart that required Camilla's judgment, a request for the previous year's music program, a contrived need for the old survey of the East Gardens. Each time their fingers almost touched passing a paper, each time they parted as if the parchment might catch fire between them. 2 incidents bent the arc of the week. The first arrived as a private invitation. The Queen requested that Louise attend a quiet tea in the winter salon. No counselors, no king, only mother and daughter and porcelain cups set among holly. Eleanor began not with politics but with a story. The day Louise was born, the king had been away negotiating a ceasefire, and the Queen had stood at the window counting clouds and cool cloths until a messenger arrived with a single line, "Safe." "I've spent your entire life trying to keep you safe," Eleanor said, eyes on the steam. "Not happy. Not free. Safe. I know the difference." The admission knocked the wind from Louise more efficiently than a reprimand would have. "Then why?" "Because the world does not forgive soft mistakes from hard positions," Eleanor said. "You may take risks that cost you comfort. You may not take risks that cost 1,000 children bread." She set down her cup. "I will not order your heart. I will tell you what the council will not. If you choose love without alliance, the consequences will be immediate and unsubtle. Trade tariffs will be weaponized. Border disputes will appear. Newspapers will turn your name into a bonfire. There are counters to each of these, slow, grinding, unglamorous, but they exist. If you make that choice, you must make it entirely, not in a moment of defiance, and then retreat." For the first time, Louise heard not a queen but a strategist outlining paths through a storm. "And if I choose alliance? Then you will have the stability to do 100 small kindnesses that do not make headlines," Eleanor said, and her voice was not unkind. "There is a dignity in that. There is also a cost. A beat. I have paid some of it." They looked at each other for a long moment in which a lifetime of misunderstandings rearranged themselves into something like comprehension. Louise left the salon with her heart split neatly into 2 maps, both treacherous, both strangely lit by the same star. The second incident was public and less gentle. During the archery exhibition, the Duke of Wexford maneuvered the conversation so that a visiting journalist asked Louise, within earshot of half the court, whether the princess favored tradition in all things, including the composition of a royal household. "The realm appreciates clarity," the Duke added, faux modest. "It calms markets." Camilla stood across the green, a ledger tucked under one arm, a bundle of arrows under the other, the rosemary pin a slash of green. Her gaze touched Louise like a question mark. Louise took her shot. She notched an arrow, drew, and let fly. The shaft struck the center ring, not the heart, because perfection would have looked like a boast. "I favor integrity," she said, lowering her bow, and let silence do the work of an exclamation. The court murmured. The Duke smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. That night, an unsigned note appeared on Louise's desk. "If you intend to choose integrity, be prepared to define it. There are many who will do so for you if you hesitate." The handwriting was unfamiliar. The sentiment was not. She burned the note in a candle and watched the ash curl like a falling petal. Amid these currents, Camilla began, reluctantly, to outline her post-gala contingency with Counselor Maris in earnest. Louise learned of it by accident, overhearing a steward ask whether the northern school required 2 additional wagons. The word struck like cold water. She cornered Camilla outside the map room, the corridor a narrow channel of stone and shadow. "You're sending for wagons," she said, more accusation than question. Camilla held her ground, though her shoulders were tight. "If Counselor Maris retires next month, we move supplies now or lose the Thorold. I told you what I would do." "You told me what you would do if I chose someone else," Louise said, and the echo of the choice made the air thin. "I haven't." "Not choosing is also a choice," Camilla said, voice soft but unyielding. "Every day you wait, the machine builds around you. When it finally closes, you'll call it inevitability because it will be easier than admitting you were afraid." The words hurt because they were aimed with love and landed with precision. Louise stepped closer, reckless on purpose. "I am afraid," she said, letting the admission live between them, warm and dangerous. "Of causing harm. Of failing the people who never asked to be pieces on our board. Of losing you because I waited too long, or because I didn't wait at all." Camilla's breath trembled, her chin lifted as if bracing for impact. "Then decide like a princess," she said. "Not for the crown, not against it, but from it. The crown is not a ring they put on your finger. It is a question you must answer every morning." A footman turned into the corridor with an armful of banners and froze, eyes wide, sensing the charged air without understanding it. Camilla stepped back, offered a pleasant nod, and was gone before Louise's pulse remembered how to slow. The days continued their relentless arithmetic. 15, 14, 13. Louise threw herself at the work behind the velvet. She met with the Guild Council and proposed a winter training program to keep apprentices employed during the slow months. She asked the archivist for treaties that had been built on unconventional alliances and found, tucked between wars and weddings, a forgotten compact between 2 queens who had traded scholars instead of soldiers and held a border steady for half a century. She brought the compact to her mother and watched surprise flicker, then calculation, then something like respect. Each small act became a stone on a path no one else could see yet. And still the pressure mounted. A carriage from Wexford arrived bearing a gift, a falcon hood too small to fit any of the palace birds, delicate and useless and exquisitely worked, accompanied by a note in the Duke's bold hand about the beauty of restraint. Louise sent a thank you penned in a script so neat it felt like armor and returned no further token. The prince from the archipelago requested a private tour of the gallery of naval charts. Louise obliged and listened, genuinely, as he described storms that taught humility better than any sermon. He left a poem in the guest book, not to her, but to the sea. She found herself liking him in a way that made the choice more complicated, because kindness is rarely the enemy and friendship almost never is. 2 nights before the mid-month council, Louise found Camilla alone in the chapel that the palace gardeners had tucked into a greenhouse long ago, a place of glass and fern and quiet, attended by ivy instead of saints. No candles burned, moonlight sifted through palms and pooled at their feet. Camilla did not turn when Louise entered. "If you mean to tell me you've chosen the Duke, please say it quickly," she said, the words steady and scraped raw. "I would rather face a clean wound than bleed by degrees." "I haven't chosen him," Louise said. "I haven't chosen anyone." "Then you're choosing the machine," Camilla said and finally faced her. "And the machine will choose for you." Louise reached for the truth and did not let herself miss. "I love you," she said, and the world went exquisitely still. Camilla inhaled like surf taking the shore. "Don't," she said, but it sounded like a plea to keep going. "I love you," Louise said again, softer, stronger. "I have for years. It has been the only constant I never had to rehearse." Tears brightened Camilla's eyes without falling. "Then run," she whispered. "Choose me. Not later. Not in the garden after a dance. Not in words that will turn to smoke when the council lights the fire. Choose me where it costs." Louise's heart surged toward the yes that lived at the center of her, messy and wild and truer than any speech she had ever given. But beyond the glass, a bell began to toll. First slowly, then in a pattern that meant summons, and the moment broke like frost underfoot. The king had called an emergency council. A messenger found them in the corridor with a bow that saw too much and said nothing. In the chamber, maps lay open, pins bristling along the northern border. The chancellor spoke of a neighboring lord testing patrol lines, of tariffs hiked overnight, of a rumor that Wexford himself had brokered the provocation to force the crown's hand. The king's glance cut to Louise. The queen's mouth set. "The gala cannot be moved," someone said. "Then the announcement must," someone else replied. The room turned, collectively, toward the princess whose personal life had become a lever on a geopolitical fulcrum. Louise stood very straight, the confession still warm on her tongue, the echo of Camilla's run still thrumming in her bones. "Integrity," she had said before a crowd. "Define it," the anonymous note had warned. 17 days had become 12. In the quiet after the council dismissed, she found Camilla waiting in the shadow of an archway, exhaustion and steel braided together in her posture. "The storm came earlier than we thought," Camilla said, as if they were discussing weather and not fate. "Good," Louise answered, surprising herself with the shape of the word. "Better to learn how we stand before the ground moves." Camilla searched her face. "Where do you stand?" "With the people," Louise said, because that had to come first or nothing else mattered. Then, lower, braver. "And with you." Camilla's breath stuttered. She closed her eyes like someone stepping into cold water. "Then prove it in the room where it counts," she said. "Not to me, to them." Louise nodded once, a vow she did not speak. She would not give the ending away. Not yet. But the machine she had been warned about began to seem less like an inevitability and more like a thing that could be rewired, piece by patient piece, if one knew which bolts to pull and which sparks to catch. 12 days. A hawk circled over the frost-stiff lawn at dawn. Somewhere in the city, a press set type. In the palace greenhouse chapel, a patch of moonlight remembered two silhouettes standing very still, a confession cooling into resolve. 11 days before the gala, the palace was a hive that never slept. At any hour, somewhere in the marble labyrinth, a seamstress's needle bit through silk, a carpenter's hammer struck rhythm into the bones of a dais, a steward barked orders over the clink of crystal and silver. Louise moved through it like a shadow that still drew eyes, her every step measured under the weight of speculation. Rumors had ripened into certainty in the court's mind. She would choose the duke. She would choose the prince from the Southern Isles. She would shock everyone with a match to a baron's daughter and call it progress. No one guessed the truth, and that ignorance was both a shield and a prison. Camilla had returned to her role with flawless precision. Too flawless. She was present at every briefing, every rehearsal for ceremonial processions, every meeting between the queen and the master of ceremonies, but she spoke to Louise only when duty required it, her words efficient and polished, her gaze slipping away just before it could linger. Louise endured it because she understood it, but the distance was a knife she carried under her ribs. That morning, the king summoned her to the strategy chamber, a long table drowned in maps and correspondence. "The Wexford matter worsens," he said without preamble. "Their tariffs are strangling our wool trade. This," he tapped a letter, "is an ultimatum disguised as courtesy. They want an answer on the marriage by the end of the week." Louise glanced at the queen, whose expression was carved from composure. "And if they don't get it?" "We can weather it," the queen said, "but it will be costly. Every ally we lose over this will require years to replace." "So we give in?" Louise asked, the words tasting like ash. "We consider the long-term stability of the realm," the king corrected, though the absence of a denial was telling. "The council meets in 3 days. We expect your recommendation." Expectation was a crown heavier than any gold. Louise nodded once, formally, and left with her hands tight at her sides. In the corridor outside, Camilla waited with a folder of seating charts for the gala, her posture unyielding. Louise took the folder, their fingers brushing briefly. 3 days, Louise said under her breath. I heard, Camilla replied, her voice neutral. Then you know I can't. I know you can, Camilla cut in quietly. The question is whether you will. Louise stared at her, frustration and longing tangling until they were indistinguishable. Come to the library tonight, she said, and didn't wait for agreement. The library was deserted after midnight, the only light the pools cast by green-shaded lamps. Camilla arrived soundless as a shadow, closing the door behind her. This is dangerous, she murmured, but she stepped closer anyway. Louise set down the treaty she'd been pretending to read. So is breathing near me these days. Camilla's mouth twitched, but her eyes were grave. If you're going to ask me to run with you, say it now before they decide for you. Louise shook her head. Not run.
Stay.
Help me build a choice that isn't him or exile, that doesn't tear the realm in half. Camilla's brow furrowed. You think you can make them accept us? I think, Louise said, leaning forward, that I can make them want what comes with us more than they want to punish what we are. She unrolled a map of trade routes, pointing to 3 lines. If we broker a coalition between these ports before the gala, we can counter Wexford's tariffs. That removes their leverage. And gives you the freedom to choose, Camilla finished softly. Or, at least the ability to survive the choice. Their shoulders touched as they bent over the table, voices low, minds racing in tandem like they had when they were children plotting elaborate escapes from etiquette lessons. For 2 hours they worked, sketching strategies in the margins of outdated maps, drafting a list of sympathetic nobles, weighing which court gossip could be turned to their advantage. At one point, their hands brushed and stayed, the silence between them thick with all the things they had no time to say. When the clock struck 3, Camilla straightened. If this works, you'll still have to stand in that ballroom and name me in front of all of them. I know, Louise said. And if it fails, you'll lose more than a crown. I know that too. Camilla's eyes searched hers, the candlelight catching in the flecks of gold. Then tell me one thing, she said. If I say yes to this, if I stand beside you in that moment, will you still choose me when it stops being a plan and starts being a scandal? Louise reached for her hand, their fingers weaving together with the certainty of years. Camilla, I've been choosing you since we were 12 and you dared me to climb the east wall just to watch the sunrise. The only difference now is that I'm ready to do it where they can see. Camilla's breath caught, and for the first time in weeks her guarded expression broke into something bright, fierce, and almost reckless. Then let's give them something worth watching. They parted before dawn, each slipping back into the machinery of the palace with nothing outward changed, except that by nightfall, 3 discreet letters had left the palace under Camilla's seal, bound for ports that might just change the course of the realm. And for the first time since the ultimatum, Louise felt the shape of hope pressing against her ribs, dangerous and alive. 9 days before the gala, the palace was no longer simply busy, it was fevered. The air smelled of beeswax and tension, every corridor humming with the sound of preparations layered over politics like gilt over cracked stone. Louise moved through it with the map she and Camilla had drafted folded into her thoughts, each corridor and staircase a step in the silent campaign they'd begun. The first reply from the coalition ports arrived at dawn, a cautious yes from the governor of Eastmoor, delivered in a hand so neat it could have been etched into glass. By noon, a messenger from the southern docks brought word that their council would convene in 2 days to vote. The last piece, Westhaven, remained silent, and that silence gnawed at Louise like an untended wound. In public, she played her part. She listened to the Duke of Wexford describe his plans for expanding the royal hunting grounds, smiled at the prince from the Isles as he recited another soft-voiced poem, allowed the Queen to walk her through the final draft of the gala's seating chart. All the while, her gaze flicked to Camilla whenever the world allowed, passing in a corridor with a bundle of correspondence, leaning over the shoulder of a scribe in the council chamber, checking the light levels in the ballroom where crystal gleamed like frozen lightning. They did not speak openly, not with the court's appetite for whispers so sharp, but a look could carry a paragraph if you knew the language, and they'd spent their lives writing it together. That evening, under the guise of reviewing the gala program, they met in the music room. Camilla closed the door behind her and set down the sheet of events. Eastmore confirmed, she said, voice low, eyes bright with a kind of focus that made Louise want to touch her. Southern Docks will vote in 48 hours. West Haven is holding out. Louise leaned back against the piano, fingers curling against its polished edge. They'll hold out until they see if we're worth the gamble. We need a public show before the gala that makes it clear we're not bending to Wexford. Something that still fits within the rules they think you're playing by, Camilla said. Exactly, Louise replied. The archipelago prince invited me to attend the harbor dedication in 2 days. If I go, and I speak about cooperation between equals, ports and palace, it will force West Haven's hand without naming them. Camilla nodded slowly. And the court will hear it as courting the prince. Which keeps suspicion focused somewhere safe, Louise said. You've become dangerous, Camilla murmured, though her mouth curved as if she liked it. Louise stepped closer, the air between them drawing tight. I learned from the best. They stood like that for a heartbeat too long, until a sound in the corridor pulled them apart. Camilla gathered the papers, her voice steady again. Be careful with the prince. He's kind, but kindness doesn't mean harmless. Neither do I, Louise said, and let her go before the room betrayed them. 2 days later, the harbor dedication unfolded under a sky so blue it looked rehearsed. Louise stood on the platform beside the prince, his hand sweeping toward the gleaming ships as if presenting a gift. She spoke of tides and trade, of alliances built on shared prosperity rather than coercion, her words chosen to sound like an invitation and a challenge at once. In the crowd, she caught sight of Camilla near the docks, speaking with a West Haven envoy whose expression shifted from skepticism to something like interest as the speech went on. By the time the applause rolled over the water, Louise knew they had them. That night, back in the palace, Camilla appeared in her study without knocking, the door closing with a soft click. They're in, she said simply. West Haven votes tomorrow, but the envoy says it's a formality. Louise felt the tension in her shoulders ease for the first time in weeks. Then we've done it, she said. Camilla shook her head. We've removed Wexford's best weapon. That's not the same as them accepting you choosing me. It's the only way they might, Louise said, stepping around the desk to stand close enough that the air seemed to hum. And if they don't? Camilla asked. Louise reached for her hand. Let their fingers link. Then I choose you anyway. And we see how much of the realm we can keep standing together. Camilla's breath caught, her eyes holding Louise's like an anchor in deep water. 9 days, she whispered. 9 days, Louise echoed, and for the first time, the number felt less like a countdown to loss and more like a measure of how much closer they were to daring the truth in front of everyone. 7 days before the gala, the air in the palace felt charged, like the moments before a storm breaks. The coalition ports had signed on, the news spreading quietly through the right channels, and while the council hadn't publicly acknowledged the shift, Louise could see it in the way conversations paused when she entered a room, in the way the Duke's smile had grown just a shade too tight. The Queen summoned her to the winter salon, a fire crackling low as snow dusted the windows. You've bought yourself leverage, Eleanor said, pouring tea with the precision of a general. Use it wisely. The council will fight harder now, not less. Louise took the cup, fingers warming against the porcelain. I'm ready to make my choice. Her mother studied her over the rim of her own cup. Then I hope you're ready for what comes after. Word of the coalition reached Wexford that afternoon, and by evening, his carriage was at the palace gates. Louise endured an hour of him circling the subject, pressing for assurances she would not give, his flattery growing sharp at the edges. She smiled, offered vague courtesies, and refused to be pinned down, every moment a careful dance. Camilla wasn't in the room, but Louise felt her absence like a missing step in a waltz. That night, she found her in the chapel greenhouse, tending a row of winter roses under the soft glow of lanterns. He's pressing harder, Louise said, stepping into the pool of light. Camilla didn't look up. Because he knows he's losing. Louise moved closer. We could end this now. Announce before the gala. Camilla finally met her gaze, eyes shadowed with both hope and fear. And give them a week to tear it apart before you even say the words in that ballroom?
No.
You wait. You walk into that night with the machines still guessing, so they don't have time to unite against you. And you? Louise asked softer now. Can you wait? Camilla's mouth curved faintly. I've been waiting for years. I can manage 7 more days. She reached for a bloom, brushing a petal with her thumb. But when you speak, Louise, don't hesitate. Not even for a breath. If you do, they'll smell blood. Louise stepped closer, until the lantern light painted gold into Camilla's eyes. When I speak, I'll be looking at you. For a moment, neither moved, the air between them warm with all the words they'd never dared to say aloud in daylight. Then footsteps echoed faintly from the corridor, and Camilla stepped back, her hand dropping to her side. 7 days, she said again, and left before the moment could become something neither of them could take back. The next days were a blur, final fittings, endless rehearsals, council sessions threaded with veiled threats and careful questions. The Queen offered no direct approval, but once, as they passed in a corridor, she murmured, "Make it count," and didn't wait for a reply. On the night before the gala, Louise stood at her window, looking out at the lanterns flickering in the gardens below. Somewhere in the palace, Camilla was likely reviewing last-minute logistics, making sure every detail would run without flaw. Tomorrow, Louise would stand in front of the court, the press, and the entire kingdom. Tomorrow, she would name her choice, not in a whisper, not in the shadows, but where every eye could see. And if the cost came due, she would pay it, because some things were worth more than crowns. The night of the gala bloomed with gold and crystal, the ballroom a cathedral of light where every polished surface seemed determined to reflect the moment back at itself. Nobles in silks and jewels moved like currents in a restless sea, the air alive with the murmur of wagers, predictions, and the faint rustle of intrigue. Louise stood at the edge of the dais beside her parents, her gown a cascade of deep sapphire that caught the light like midnight water, the weight of the crown not yet on her head but heavy all the same. She could feel the court watching her with a hunger sharpened by weeks of suspense, each gaze a hook waiting to catch on her choice. Across the room, near the line of attendants, stood Camilla, calm, poised, her hair coiled into an elegant knot, the small rosemary pin still glinting like a private oath. Their eyes met for a heartbeat that tasted of years, then the herald's voice rang out, calling for silence. The king spoke first, welcoming the assembled dignitaries, praising alliances old and new, each word a reminder of the stakes. The queen followed, her voice carrying the steel and warmth of someone who had learned to braid both. Then it was Louise's turn. She stepped forward into the light, the weight of every watching eye settling over her. "Tonight," she began, her voice clear, steady, "we celebrate the bonds that strengthen our realm, trade, trust, shared purpose. And tonight, I honor the tradition of naming the one who will stand beside me as I carry the crown." A ripple passed through the crowd, the anticipation tightening like a bowstring. She let it stretch. "Many have sought this role," she continued, her gaze sweeping the room. "Princes, dukes, envoys of skill and vision. I have been honored by each offer. But my choice is not made from titles or treaties. It is made from the truth I have carried all my life, the truth that has shaped the person I am, the leader I will be." She turned then, not to the duke, not to any of the waiting suitors, but to where Camilla stood. The room seemed to inhale all at once. "Camilla Maris," she said, the name ringing like a bell in the hush, "you have been my confidant, my challenger, my compass. You have stood beside me in every season, seen me whole when others saw only a crown. I choose you, not in secret, not in shadows, but here, before our people, as my partner in life and in rule." Gasps scattered through the hall like dropped pearls. The duke's smile froze, a crack running clean through it. The queen's expression was unreadable for a long, taut moment, then her chin lifted, as if acknowledging a move well played. Camilla didn't move at first, her stillness a shield against the weight of the moment. Then, With the kind of grace that cannot be taught, she crossed the floor. The crowd parted without a word. When she reached Louise, she bowed, not deeply, but enough to honor the formality, then straightened, eyes bright and unflinching. "You have all the courage in the world," she said quietly, meant for Louise alone. "And you've just used it." Louise took her hand, their fingers twining with the ease of something practiced in secret for years. Applause began hesitantly, then grew, layered with murmurs, some approving, some calculating, some already plotting what this would mean for the realm. But Louise didn't look away from Camilla, not even as the herald declared the choice official, not even as the music swelled to reclaim the room. In that moment, the crown felt lighter, because she had chosen it on her own terms. Later, after the formalities, after the endless toasts and the sharp-edged smiles, they slipped into the gardens, the winter air crisp against their skin. Lantern light painted Camilla's face in gold and shadow. "You've just rewritten the rules," Camilla murmured. "Then we'll learn to play the new game together," Louise said. Camilla smiled, the kind that reached her eyes. "I waited a long time to hear you say that." "And you?" Louise asked, their foreheads